So,
Yeah.
you've highlighted one very key divide in India, which is the rural-urban divide. And I want to jump into that in just a second. One really interesting thing that you mentioned also is this idea of the demand for female labor, and that's fascinating. I want to ask you how that kind of plays into the idea that um, social norms often govern what's acceptable for women to do or not to do in the labor force. So how do those two kind of intertwine? Um, and then finally, I want to jump into social norms in particular and think about sort of what role do you think they play? Are they, a factor, or so are they negligible in this kind of discussion? But before we get to that, I mean, just to you know zoom out on this discussion a little bit, I absolutely agree with the statistics that you laid out with regard to labor force participation and the role of women that women play in household production all around the world. Um, One kind of question that comes to mind in this is, um, what we've seen in India is that India seems to have fallen a little bit off that kind of inverse U-shaped curve that you could draw, which is actually a fairly good predictor for most countries with respect to the relationship between female labor force participation and GDP per capita. So as India's GDP per capita has risen, we should see it kind of, moving up on the curve a little bit, and we haven't seen that. And in fact, just the level of participation seems to be quite off the curve as well. In terms of the idea of measurement, I want to jump into that first. Um, what do you think is going on with respect to the way that female labor force participation is measured, particularly in rural areas, that makes it such that we're classifying some of the same tasks that men and women do as being part of the labor force for men and not for women? And do you think that's different? Do you think that's unique to India, or is that going to be true in any agrarian economy? Should we expect that in rural parts of Denmark or Sweden as well, or is this something that's particular to India?
So again, let me take your last point. I mean, I think this would be true of any agrarian economy that is not highly mechanized. So I wouldn't say Denmark and Sweden would fit the bill, but certainly, Nepal and Bangladesh, etc. These would. So I think that, and maybe Nepal, Sweden and Denmark fit the bill some years ago, but no longer. So I think that when you look at agrarian work in advanced, developed economies, it gets organized differently. So it's a completely, more or less completely monetized, the work.
Right.
And it's clear this is the enterprise, that's the, so a lot of the economic details of the enterprise are very clearly established, and whether the woman is working on it or not, I mean, that's clear. On the question of measurement, so there are two or three things that I would like to point out. One is that Sonal Desai, who runs the IHDS, the India Human Development Survey, which is a big data set, they are running a Delhi metropolitan area survey where they're piloting new ways in which questions can be asked. And they have a very nice 3 or 4 page brief where they ask the question the same way, which is are you a worker? Do you work? And you say yes or no. Does your wife work? Yes or no, etc., etc. You go down the household roster and you ask everybody, ask the head of the respondent about the status of work.
Right.
They ask, in some households, they ask, what is the work that the household does? So they'll say, oh no, we have livestock, we have farm, we have a store, whatever it is. And then they say, who works on these things? Who works on these activities?
Right.
And so because the question is not about workers, it's about work, people reply very honestly. Whereas the minute you ask them about workers, then it's typically women. So, women tend to get undercounted. So they actually show the contrast between asking about work as opposed to asking about workers.
That's fascinating.
Right? And so it's an amazing thing. That's one thing that I'd like to point out. The other is,
And sorry, just
in the, sorry.
just curiosity, but how big of a gap does that open up? So, how much in labor force participation rate can you sort of explain, or, how much does that increase the rate?
Yeah, I should have remembered these numbers and pulled it out.
Okay.
Yeah,
We
but
can,
it's a
we
fairly
can,
significant, it's a fairly significant gap
that's fascinating.
between the proportion. So, so that's that. The other is that if you look at, so India just released its first ever time use survey, which was done in 2019. But this was preceded by a pilot survey done 20 years ago across six states of India. And
Okay.
at that time, the sort of leading feminist economists, the early, the early pioneers were trying to demonstrate this point to the Indian national statistical bodies
Yeah.
that you're not counting the work of women, and so they piloted this time use survey. I mean, the NSS piloted it, but they contributed to the questionnaire, and they classified activities as system of national accounts, SNA, the usual production
Yeah.
boundary, and then they classified activities as extended SNA. And if you add up the participation in SNA and extended SNA, in rural areas, actually women's work participation rate, if you add both, it's higher than men's.
Wow.
It was in 98 in these six states. So what I'm not saying that this is a gold standard way of measurement or anything like that. But the point that is emerging from all of this is that how you measure work does matter. My recent work with Naila Kabir of the London School of Economics, we did a survey in West Bengal.
Mm-hmm.
And there also we piloted, we tweaked the national sample survey questions just a little bit and were able to get much higher labor force participation rates. So for example, in West Bengal, the state levels average is about 17%. And with
Mm-hmm.
our methods, and I can talk about that a little bit more in detail, but we get something like 56, 58%, depending on how what activities you measure versus what you don't. So that's the order of magnitude of difference, right?
Right.
And so the large part of the story is about counting, okay?
Right.
But
Right.
it's and the social norm story. So people, when they think of India and they think of social norms, they think of you're not allowed to go out, and there is rape, and there is sexual violence, and etc., etc. The real social norm that I think prohibits women from participating fully in paid economic work, provided there's work available, is the social norm that women are predominantly responsible for domestic chores.
Right.
Everywhere,
Right.
women do more domestic work than men, but in South Asia, and particularly in India and Pakistan, the ratio of time that women spend on domestic chores relative to what men spend on domestic chores is one of the highest in the world.
Yeah.
So even in the 2019 survey, women spend at least 10 times the time on domestic chores relative to men. And
Wow.
this is so the social norm that I would like to focus on is this one,
Yeah.
not the sexual violence and not the rape and not all this other
Right.
stuff that people,
Right.
focus on.
Right. No, absolutely. I think that's absolutely right, that the kind of household labor of women is, in some areas of the world, sort of almost unreplaceable by men, and,
Yeah.
as governed by social norms. And so that just automatically means it's almost impossible for a woman to hold down a time outside the household.
Yeah. But I think that it's important to, because the social norms is a very generic term, and it includes everything. And typically, because when you look at, for example, the media stories about India in the West, you see, they show a lot of poverty, and they show a lot of sort of poor, miserable people, etc., etc. And so the impression that you get is, oh, here are these oppressed women who are just being not allowed to leave the home because that's actually this couldn't be further from the truth. I
That's
mean,
right.
Indian women are remarkably gutsy. They are remarkably brave. They migrate, they go out of the house, they do all kinds of things. They manage with very little, so they are very innovative also.
Yeah,
There's
absolutely.
this sort of native sense of saving. I mean, I'm not glorifying poverty, but all I'm trying to say is that the impression of this sort of bend double under the burden of the parda kind of a woman, that doesn't fit the bill as far as Indian women are concerned. But because she's supposed to be exclusively responsible for domestic chores, and this is true about urban upper class women as well, often women will make the choice saying, well, I can't, exactly what's happening now in the United States. I mean, women are just, not because of any other norm, it's just, I can't manage everything. There's a limit to how much you can manage. And if I have to do all this other work, I'm not going to be able to do paid work as well.
That's right. I mean,
Plus, yeah, and plus in India, of course, there's a question of demand for work also. So, there's that issue as well.
yeah, so this is, I mean, that's really fascinating. And I think it is important to think about, so first you mentioned the measurement issues around this, which honestly might have, um, you know, as at their origin, some sort of discrimination or norm associated with what is counted and what's not counted, right? At the end of the day, if a respondent is saying this many men were involved and fewer women were involved, when that's actually not the truth, is based on some sort of bias that is making him or her count differently, the work of women. So I think there is sort of that inherent, reinforcement, that women don't provide work, and so if we're counting up how much work a woman did in the house, we're going to discount that. But I think there's also, like you mentioned, I think it'd be fascinating for the Indian government to adopt some of these new, advances to survey methodology that actually just small tweaks can actually make a big difference in this regard. So that's really fascinating coming out of your work, because it goes a long way to kind of understand this puzzle.